Hello, everyone. Welcome to another abvote.ca Hangout. I'm Mac Mail, better known online as Master Mac. And with us tonight, we have the leader of Alberta's NDP, Rachel Notley, who's joining us for the first part of the show. And after she has to run off to, I'm sure, another campaign engagement, the three of us, Dave and Ryan and myself, will continue chatting about all things election and politics in Alberta. So first of all, I'm going to let the guys introduce themselves, and then we'll hand over to Rachel. So Ryan, do you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Ryan Hassman. I'm the conservative side of this panel, and you can follow me at Ryan Hassman.
And I'm Dave Cournoyer. I guess I'm one of the more progressive sides of this panel, and you can follow me on my blog at daveberta.ca or on Twitter at Dave Cournoyer.
Okay, and thank you for taking some time to join us tonight. Rachel, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
All right. Well, I'm Rachel Notley. I'm the leader of Alberta's NDP, and I'm applying for the job of Premier in this election that we have just embarked upon. I've been the MLA for Edmonton Strathcona since 2008, and before that worked as a lawyer and a labor representative for a number of different unions, and have kids and married and live in Strathcona. And I'm at, what is my handle actually? At Rachel Notley, I assume, right? Yeah. I can never remember it. It just comes up. Anyway, so yeah, that's I guess how I'll start. I've never done this before, so this is kind of a new thing for me, and hopefully we'll have a good chat today.
Sounds good. We've only done this a few times ourselves, so we're all still learning how best to do this. So why don't we dive right into some questions, and maybe I'll go first here. How are you feeling just a few days into another election campaign?
Well, you know, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that the election came early, and there's no question. You know, I was talking to a reporter a couple days ago, and he said, so, you know, they had a little bit of an election law out there. What happened to that? And I think that's kind of what we have now in Alberta, is a little bit of an election law. And so we didn't really need to go, but nonetheless we are now, and we're ready. And I think at this point we're in a unique position, because I really think that there are genuine alternatives for Alberta voters this time around. And so I'm feeling pretty excited, pretty optimistic, and looking forward to talking with Albertans about some of the ideas that Alberta's NDP has for the future of our province in years going forward.
Great. And what do you think is different potentially about this time compared to last time? What would you say is the big shift, or is there a shift?
You know, I think I don't know that I would necessarily call it a shift, but it's sort of a cycle, and the cycle is getting shorter each time, and people are getting very frustrated. You know, in the environmental context, people talk a lot about the idea of social license. You know, you need to have social license in order to embark upon things where you ask people to give up certain rights or give up certain expectations. And I think that, you know, I've started thinking about it, the idea of, you know, political license, and how much political license does this PC government have anymore? And I am seeing and hearing on the doorsteps and from our candidates and from our volunteers that political license is coming to an end, and the level of patience that Albertans have is diminishing significantly. The tank is empty. And so it doesn't take much for people to lose faith and get pretty irritated with the government. And so that's what I'm seeing, certainly in our campaigns. You know, every day people who were long-standing Tories are coming into our campaign office, coming up to me on the street, you know, tweeting me, Facebooking me, saying, that's it, you know, you have my vote this time, I'm done. So that's, it feels different for me now. I wasn't leader in the last election. So you'd have to sort of ask Brian too, but it definitely feels different from as far as I can see in the way I'm experiencing the election so far, that's for sure.
Great, Dave. Do you want to jump in with the next question?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Rachel. Some recent polls have shown your party's doing fairly well. I mean, it's early in the campaign. You said you're applying for the job of premier. I guess my question is, say things work out your way on May 25th and the NDP win form government. What would your government's first two pieces of legislation be?
What would our first two pieces of legislation be? Well, we introduced a private members bill on the last day of the session, and didn't get a lot of coverage, of course, because that was also budget day. But it was we like to call it the they wouldn't let us call it with the LEO, but nonetheless we call it the Resource Owners' Rights Act. And it's an act that's designed to set up a commission that is independently comprised of experts, of people within the oil and gas industry, of workers within the oil and gas industry, of environmental experts, and of economic experts to look at having a regular, transparent examination of whether we're getting our fair share of the royalties from our resources, and whether there are ways in which we can incent better upgrading, more upgrading of the resources, more value-added jobs here in Alberta, so that as a resource we get a greater benefit from it, rather than ripping it and shipping it as fast as possible, leaving nothing in its wake for generations to come. We have an obligation to Albertans to manage this resource responsibly. I don't believe that we have been up until now, and I think that we need a mechanism of ensuring that Albertans know that this is being managed with their best interests in mind, and that it's done transparently and responsibly. So that would be certainly the first thing that we would do. In terms of other things, I mean, there's so much that we would want to do in terms of improving our health care, in terms of improving our education system. It's not necessarily legislative at the very outset, but it is about priorities, and it's about making sure that those important public services that Albertans rely on a great deal are properly managed, properly resourced, and that people can be sure that the health care is there for them when they need it, and that their kids can count on getting a good education in their classrooms.
Okay, now, just if I can have a follow-up question. You touched on health care, and I mean, health care is always a big issue for Albertans. This current government in I think around 2008 or 2009 merged all of the health regions to create Alberta Health Services, and since then they've been, been problematic, creating such a huge bureaucracy. And I know the other parties. I know the Wild Rose Party has said that it wants to break up Alberta Health Services. The PCs have said that they're going to create districts within Alberta Health Services, and I don't know exactly what the Liberals have said. But what would you do if on day one, if you were premier? Would you keep Alberta Health Services? What would you do to improve Alberta's healthcare system?
Well, that's a really good question, and if you go back to 2008, there's no question that when the PCs disbanded all the regional health boards and created it, were highly critical, because there was a lot of problems. It negated the good work that was being done in the regions. It created a huge amount of chaos and created this massive super board. And so there's a lot of good reasons not to be in favor of it. The concern that I have now, though, is that there's so much change on care structure that we're creating a chaos cost or a chaos fee. And so really what I want to do is I'm less concerned about the organization of AHS at this point than I am about providing some stability and allowing for their longer term strategies developed to improve frontline services and to improve the quality of care in frontline services. So while on one hand we do need to find a way to be more responsive to regional needs and in particular rural needs, I'm actually not that interested in embarking upon yet another reorganization, because I think there's a huge amount of change fatigue, not just sound like an organizational behavioralist, but there is, and the people who work in the system are really tired of this, and they want to be able to focus on what they're there to do, which is to get people healthy, keep people healthy, or prevent people from getting ill, and that should be the focus.
Okay, sounds good. If you're just joining us, thanks for tuning in to the AB Vote Hangout. We're talking with Rachel Notley, the MLA for Edmonton Strathcona, and the leader of the NDP here in Alberta. Ryan, I'm going to throw over to you for the next question.
Hi, Rachel. I actually just want to follow up on this healthcare discussion. So there's been some talk around creating centers of excellence, consolidating once-in-a-lifetime procedures, such as a hip replacement, by gaining safety or quality or efficiency, by having someone who does 400 of them a year rather than 4 do the procedure. The problem is,
Ryan, I got to, you know what, I think I'm.
Go ahead.
I don't know if someone can maybe send me a note about.
We'll wait. Let us know when you're back
what
on.
your question was.
Are you with us?
Okay,
I
can hear you now.
I'll be quicker.
Yeah.
How do you balance rural healthcare needs with creating centers of excellence that are more efficient and focused on single procedures?
Okay, well, I don't know that it's one versus the other. I think that we've seen some examples of some smart delivery of certain types of procedures, like I think you mentioned hip replacements in the bit that I heard there, and we saw some successes, for instance, in Capital Health with some of that work before AHS blew it up, but I don't know that it's an either or an or in terms of rural healthcare. I think there's basic things that are absent with respect to rural healthcare right now that we need to focus on. I mean, we ought not to have young mothers have obstetric care. We ought to be able to have people get basic preventative health care in the communities in which they live. We shouldn't have somebody having to drive from Slave Lake once a week to get dialysis. Those kinds of things, those are not the super specialized things. Those are basic health care services that we want to see more of in our rural areas. Obviously, we're not going to have the Mazankowski Center in every community across the province, and I think most Albertans understand that. But it's a question of ensuring that there's enough basic care in our rural communities that we're not, costing people huge amounts of money for the cost of getting care, taking time off work, traveling down to Edmonton, finding places to stay, all that kind of stuff. We're not, slowing down the economy as people do that to get basic health care. So we should be able to provide that in the rural settings, and then at the same time certainly focus strategically on how we deliver specialized services in the central areas. But really, in my view, I got to say, healthcare is such a complicated area, and we could talk for about 2 hours now, at least. All of you are done. But if you were going to really narrow it down, I think there's 2 key areas we need to focus on in healthcare in the most urgent of ways. One is long-term care. The other is mental health care. If you look at filling up our emergency rooms, filling up beds such that surgical procedures across the boards are being delayed. It's people getting care in the wrong place. And the 2 single sources of that, or the 2 biggest, are long-term care and mental health care. Both of those are as a result of this government making very intentional decisions to either downgrade the level of care or privatize the level of care in both of those settings. And so what happens is, when you meld the private and increasingly privatized form of delivery with a public form of delivery, the safety net becomes the most expensive public place, which is our emergency room and our hospitals. And so we need to stop that model. We need to back away from it. In the long term, that's how we start to deliver healthcare more effectively across the system as a whole.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, and I wrote it out for you on the side there just in case. But, it really comes down to, there have been other NDP governments across the country before. Some, I think we can agree, have been quite successful. Roy Romanoff in Saskatchewan, others maybe not so much, the Ray government in Ontario. I'm not asking you to comment on those, but you know, many voters in Alberta have not considered voting NDP, you know, outside of your areas of strength. So what would you say to voters today who may or may not consider voting NDP for the first time?
Well, you know, one of the things that people are often surprised about, in particularly sort of historically conservative voters, when I'm talking with them the first time, they don't know, for instance, that in fact the NDP has the best record of any of the three major political parties across the country with respect to fiscal responsibility and balanced budgets. Nobody balances budgets more frequently than the NDP. And so for people that are concerned about that and long-term debt and that kind of thing, that's, I think, a really important thing to bear in mind. You know, I personally think that Liberals have to own Bob Rae now, just to be clear. I think we get to offload that one. But honestly, I mean, to be fair to Bob Rae, I mean, he took over that government at a time that Ontario was entering into an incredible recession. And so, you know, I mean, that was a challenging time to govern. Where have we heard that before? But but you know, Alberta, the NDP has some excellent records across the country, and there's a lot of times that the NDP has introduced ideas, and then right-wing governments have come in and they haven't undone them because, lo and behold, they were really good ideas. You know, in BC and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, for instance, conservative governments have had lots of opportunity. They've had lots of opportunity to get rid of, you know, our hydro, and they never have. And those are things that the NDP took the initiative on. So we have a lot of good ideas. The key is balance, it's moderation, and it's ensuring that you focus always on what's the best interest for regular families. In our case, regular Alberta families.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a...
Sorry, we've been getting some questions on Twitter from people. Thanks for doing that using the ABVote hashtag. Dave, do you want to read that one out for us?
Yeah, I do, and this is actually a question that I wanted to ask as well, so it works out. Lane Anderson from Lethbridge has a question. What would be your plan to shift Alberta away from oil reliance?
Well, there's a number of different things. I mean, I think the first thing we have to understand is energy is a big part of our economy, and you know, it would be unwise not to take advantage of that as much as we can. So within the energy file, first of all, I would want to see it diversify what we do with energy. In terms of the other thing, of course, that we have to do is understand that Alberta has tremendous potential when it comes to renewable energy, and we've really dropped the ball on that one as a government in terms of encouraging that. I mean, we see renewable energy growing, but it's almost despite the government, not because of it. We're the only province in the country without a renewable energy strategy, for heaven's sake. So just in terms of that energy file, still, that's what we need to do. But we can also you know, encourage diversification in other areas. We can look at you know, a simple thing that I'm really a big fan of, frankly, is ensuring that we maintain access to post-secondary education, whether it be apprenticeship training, whether it be college or university, doesn't really matter. Innovation comes from a well-educated population. And we, of course, have some of the most disturbing trends and statistics in terms of how effectively and how frequently we educate on school. So we need to do a better job of getting Albertans, or making our post-secondary more accessible. So those are some of the ideas. And then, of course, you know, we have to look at, well, what can we do? The area of the arts and arts and culture is another area. It happens to be one of the areas which is most effective at job creation, really, for the least amount of money. And of course, it builds community in a way that is unmatched. And you know, we used to be quite good about that under Lougheed. We backed away from it over the years, primarily through the decline years. And I think that we should also look at celebrating the opportunities we have in that sector as well.
Okay, thank you for that. So we've got another Twitter question, but before Ryan reads that one for us, I want to ask you one for me, actually. I was looking at Dave's list of nominated candidates, which he's been keeping up to date throughout the election, and your party is the only other party with 87, also all across the province. And I'm just curious to know, your base of support has been in Edmonton, of course. What are you guys going to do to try to break through in other parts of the province?
Well, there's a number of things that I've been doing, and I'm very proud of it because it's something that's been a big focus for me. Is I'm very proud that we actually have slightly more than 50% of our candidates are women. And that's not only across the board, but that's in our sort of areas of theoretical traditional strength, like in Edmonton and places like that. We've got a lot of we've got real gender balance, and I think that's really important because people need to see people like themselves in the assembly if it's going to be engaging, if they're going to feel truly represented. And we've got a problem with that in politics across the country. But certainly in Alberta, and so I'm very pleased that we've been able to offer that. And the statistics show that if you offer people both a man and a woman, they'll be elected at the same frequency. And so it's up to parties to make that special effort, and we have, and I'm proud of it. That being said, I digress, I know. But that being said, in terms of breaking into other parts of the province, when I ran to be leader, I was very clear that that was going to be my focus from day one. I launched my campaign for leadership in Calgary, and since then I'm traveling quite energetically, I would say, not very regularly, but also, to Lethbridge and to northern Alberta and other parts of the province. And I think it really comes down to taking the time to go to those communities, to reach out to community leaders, to reach out to people who we wouldn't normally think were New Democrats. So talk to people that you assume they may not be your supporters, but you know what? They're not going to change their mind if you don't reach out to them and talk to them. So I've been doing a lot of that. And one of the things that comes from that is that, lo and behold, you find supporters in areas you never thought you would. And we've been really doing a lot of work building a great network of candidates across the province. And so that I know that there are fabulous who would make excellent MLAs, and who I would be very excited to be sitting beside in the legislature. And that's the kind of work that you have to do to get to that point.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, Ryan, do you want to take the next Twitter question then?
Sure. So there's two parts. One was a tweet and one was an email sent just to me. Will the NDP introduce a sales tax, a PST? And I'd like to broaden that out a bit more to talk about corporate taxes. The Prentice government quite famously didn't touch them. So what would be the ideal approach? And maybe even in particular, how would you differentiate between mom and pop small businesses versus the large corporations?
Sure. Well, first of all, in terms of the sales tax, we've been very clear that that's not a policy that we're in favor of. Consumption taxes are sort of an awkward tool in terms of achieving sort of that progressive or fair nature of the tax system. So that's just not a go-to place, and particularly in Alberta where we've got this ridiculous flat tax, that needs to go, and that's something that really hasn't one extra category in it, but that's not a truly progressive tax, and so that's one thing that I would say needs to be changed and then evaluated before anyone starts looking at a sales tax. With respect to corporate taxes, we've been fairly open that we think that profitable corporations need to roll up their sleeves and come to the table and offer up their contribution to helping all of Alberta get out of this fiscal mess that the PCs have left us in. And quite honestly, I've met with business people across the province who say to me quite openly, listen, we know that the conditions of a healthy investment environment are not defined by 1 or 2 points of a corporate tax. We know that a healthy investment environment is one that is much more holistic. It looks at the availability of the labor force, the education of the labor force, infrastructure, public services, land values. I mean, those are all things that either attract or repel investment. And so, changing an environment to retain a competitive corporate tax environment, while still asking corporations to pay their fair share. And I think that when you particularly look at it paired with the policy that we announced today, with the job creators tax credit, there's opportunities for corporations to reduce the tax they pay in an incented way by focusing on creating jobs. And that's something that's really important because Albertans are worried about jobs right now. It seems weird. 6 months ago, nobody talked about that. We talked about there being too many jobs. Now people are quite rightly worried about jobs. And so we need to address that. But let's address it in a way rather than making sort of broad statements that you just keep these bargain basement race to the bottom reckless corporate tax cuts in place and then cross your fingers and hope they don't fire too many people. That's not responsible governance.
I have a question from Twitter, and this is talking more about the electoral politics than policy. The question is, a lot of progressive votes went to the PCs at the end of the last election. What is your plan to keep progressive voters or attract them to the NDP?
I'm sorry, so I think what you said was a lot of progressive voters went to the PCs at the end of the last election. Was that your question? Sorry. And what am I going to do to stop that?
Correct.
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remind them what happened when they did that last time. They voted for a government that promised to A, be progressive and do things like end child poverty in 5 years, and B, the other promise of the PCs in 2012 was very clear. We promised not to be the wild rose. I mean, really, the election in 2012. And of course they broke both of those promises. They invited the wild rose into their caucus, and they have not run a progressive agenda. They broke, Alison Redford broke most of her key promises within a year of being elected. And as I'm sure most of you know, I mean, I see that promise to end child poverty in 5 years to have a symbolic commitment. And what is troubling about it is that they never lifted a finger on it at all, and I just don't know how you make those kinds of promises and then ignore them with the impunity that they did. But anyway, so that's the first thing, is you sort of say, geez, how did it work for you last time? And I don't know that that's a very hard argument to make, because I think most voters remember that, and that goes back to the issue of how much political license this party, this PC party, has anymore. And I think Albertans are getting increasingly unwilling to accept this narrative of the constant reinvention. And particularly with Jim Prentice, he very clearly tried to position himself to the right. And if he then sort of stumbles over to the center or center minute of the campaign because he's worried about the NDP, for instance, well, I just don't think anyone's going to buy it. But all that being said, it's also about what we say. So what we're going to do is continue the work of talking to Albertans in 87 ridings across the province about what we want to do to make life better for Albertans, to be in the corner of regular Alberta families, and to stick up for them, and to adopt an approach that we don't have to all accept less and beat ourselves up for the position that we're in, that it is absolutely possible for families to expect that tomorrow can be better than yesterday, and that the same opportunities exist for their kids.
Okay, great. So I know we're kind of at the half hour here, and I know you've got to run, Rachel, so we want to give you an opportunity to share some closing thoughts with us and with everyone watching. So what message would you want to leave voters with tonight?
Well, I'd like them to know that there is an opportunity for a real alternative in Alberta. I know that voters are very frustrated, but they're also looking for a real alternative. Alberta's NDP is that real alternative. I was very clear on the day that the writ was dropped. I'm not running for second place. I'm running to be premier, and we're putting a campaign in place that ensures that in every corner of Alberta, people can vote for that outcome with confidence, if that's the way They want to see the process. So people will give that some thought and come and join us as we work together to build a more optimistic and ultimately prosperous Alberta.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again for taking the time to join us tonight and for answering questions from us and from Twitter. And on behalf of Dave and Ryan, we want to wish you well and good luck, and thanks again.
Thanks. It's been fun. Take care.
All right. So if you guys are still take care. If you guys are still watching the Hangout, Dave and Ryan and I are going to stick around here a little bit. We still got 30 minutes in our hour. We usually do these shows for an hour, so there's lots to talk about. Lots of stuff has been happening, obviously, since the writ dropped a few days ago. So, Ryan, do you want to suggest a starting point for us?
Yeah, sure. It was great of the NDP leader to join us. You've had the best, now you're stuck with the rest, I guess. But we've had a large number of Twitter questions here, so I think we have a lot to talk about. My perspective on the NDP is nuanced for sure. I think that she is a great political leader. I think she's a great communicator. She's hard not to like. I've talked to many conservatives from all stripes who actually kind of like her. So she's doing something. I think she's connecting with Albertans in a way that maybe the other leaders haven't found a way to yet. Of course, then you're brought back, though, to the reality that the NDP does have a certain perception. As much as they talk about moderation and centrist ideas, I don't think the typical Albertans perceives them as being centrist. And, that's not her fault. That's just the party. So it'll be interesting to see how she continues to fight for that moderate piece of real estate. I noticed today they talked about a tax credit for hiring for small businesses, which I don't think she got to in her comments, but
mentioned it very briefly. Yeah, just very briefly.
Yeah, so I guess it's going to come down to you've got Edmonton. I mean, Alberta politics has always come down to basically 3 regions, right? Edmonton, Calgary, and everywhere else. And so if they clean up in Edmonton, and the PCs do well in Calgary, and the Wildrose does well everywhere else, we could have a race on our hands.
Yeah, I think it'll be one of the things that makes this election interesting is, and we've seen this in the polls that have come out over the past few days, and I mean, not to focus too much on the polls, but what you were talking about, Ryan, with the 3 regions, I mean, we really have 3 parties competing. We have one party that's competitive everywhere, and that's the PC party. They're realistically the only party that's running a province-wide campaign, running serious candidates in every riding, or you could argue closest to serious candidates in every riding. You have the NDP, which is polling very strong in Edmonton, has attracted some pretty good candidates in Edmonton. Looks like there's potential for the NDP in at least one of the Lethbridge ridings and maybe one riding in Calgary. And then the Wildrose Party, which has always been, since it was created, has always been strong in rural Alberta. So you have 3 parties, but you have both opposition parties competing with the Conservatives in different parts of the province. So unlike previous elections where you would have the Liberals and the NDP competing over a bunch of seats in Edmonton in order to form official opposition, you have 2 different parties competing with the Conservatives in order to form official opposition in different parts of the province, from different parts of the province. Which I think is kind of unique in at least in recent Alberta elections.
So last time in the last election, there was this run-up of momentum for the Wildrose as well, right? They seem to have a lot of momentum, certainly getting toward Election Day. And I think maybe it's fair to say a lot of that was with Danielle Smith. She's obviously not in the picture this time, and we have Brian Jean now with the Wildrose. So what are your guys' thoughts on them? Do you think that they're going to have a similar amount of momentum as they did back in 2012? Or, it feels to me like a very different Wildrose party. Whoever wants to jump in on that one.
Well, I'll jump in. I think it's going into the last election, I mean, people were seriously talking about the Wildrose Party forming government, and I'm not sure anybody's, even though they're doing well in the polls, I'm not sure anybody's seriously talking about the Wildrose forming government, or at least if there were a minority situation, maybe winning, the most seats of the 3 parties.
But last time they had, like Dave, you've been tracking the candidates too. They had a lot more candidates last time as well, right? They seem to have better organization, more money, all the things that they don't have this time.
Yeah, and they have about 65 candidates. I think my list showed this morning nominated so far. So that's 65 candidates, and there are 87 ridings. So there's they're definitely behind in terms of their candidate count, and that'll give you an idea of where the party is actually seriously contesting seats. I mean, I think the thing that you could say what did in the Wild Rose Party in the last election was really the narrative of the campaign really changed. And it's hard to tell right now. I mean, it's the first week of the campaign, so it's always hard to tell what the narrative of the campaign is going to be. 3 years ago, in the first week of the 2012 election, we were talking about the No Meat Committee, that infamous committee of MLAs who were meeting and getting paid or who weren't meeting and getting paid to be members of this committee. By the last week of the campaign, we were talking about Lake of Fire. So, what happens over a 4-week period I mean, the campaigns really matter. The issues that dominate the campaign and the narratives that the parties are pushing and that the media is creating really help determine what the results are.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we went live. 3 years ago, the PC government had a pretty rough lead up. Dave mentioned no meat. It's hard to imagine a worse 6 months. And then it's hard to imagine a worse first 3 weeks. There were stories about chaos in the PC camp, and they may or may not have fired their campaign manager and brought in some people from Toronto and the whole story. But at the end of the day, when people got to their ballot box and they had to actually say, am I ready to change governments, they weren't. So someone wrote today that maybe the PCs, maybe the voters want to send the PCs to the doghouse, but not necessarily to the gallows. It's easy to say, but I feel like we've seen this before. We've seen crazy polls. We've seen a strong opposition leader, a dynamic leader getting lots of attention. So maybe it'll come down. I mean, the dynamic is different this time because they have 2 major competitors instead of 1, but if I had to predict the result tonight, I'd still predict a strong PC majority.
Mm-hmm. I'd predict a strong PC majority as well. Just speaking about just the polls, and one of the things that polls are good for are creating narratives. And as a blogger, I love talking about polls and writing about polls and the narratives that they create. And I think one of the narratives that our guest who was on the show, I'm sure, is going to help curate over the next 3 weeks is that the NDP is the main progressive alternative to the PC party. So I think we will see a lot, and we'll hear a lot of NDP candidates referring to those polls to try to encourage Liberal voters and maybe Alberta Party voters and moderate PCs that they are the one alternative on the progressive side of the political spectrum to the PC. So I think in terms of those polls, I think that'll be very useful for the NDP and very interesting to see how if that actually works.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, the narrative piece too, just because last time, if you're a PC supporter and you're getting toward election day and all you're hearing about is the Wild Rose and potentially they're strong enough to form government, people were actually talking about the PCs losing last time, and then it took some pretty severe storylines to come to fruition for people to change and to say, I'm going to go and actually make my vote for the PC. So this time, with the 2 parties, maybe there's less of a chance that you're going to get that last-minute rush back to the PCs like Rachel talked about earlier in the show today, right? But again, then like you say, Dave, it's all about narratives, and who knows what'll come up in 4 weeks, right?
And we saw in the first week of we're still in the first week of the campaign. We saw, I think yesterday or the day before, Jim Prentice alluding to his competitors, his opponents on the extreme left and the extreme right. I mean, he didn't even have to say the Wild Rose and the NDP, but he's trying to cast them as the extremes of the political spectrum. I'm not totally convinced that they are the extremes of the political spectrum. I think the 3 political parties are probably actually closer to each other than not. I'm sure there are partisans out there and people on Twitter who disagree with me. But it definitely shows that the PCs are probably picking up similar results in their own polls. At least enough to be spooked about it, or to at least be spooked by the public narrative that it could be a 3-week, and they could be afraid of being squeezed out the middle. I think what's going to be interesting over the next 3 weeks is we haven't even begun to see the massive onslaught of progressive conservative advertising and dominating the airwaves that we're going to see. The PCs have a massive war chest, and they haven't even begun to spend it. I think I think Don Braid in the Calgary Herald. Hopefully I'm not misattributing his comment, but he said essentially wrote, if the PCs think they're in trouble, the Lake of Fire. What we saw at the Lake of Fire in 2014 will be just a kid's pool. I think is what his comment was. So, I mean, the PCs, they've been in power for 43 years. They're very good at keeping themselves in power, and I think that if they see this election as a threat, they'll go full bore with their advertising and everything they can.
It looked like signs were up, moments after the writ dropped all over the place. I saw people posting on Twitter, and I saw my first Jim Prentice commercial on TV today, Choose Alberta's Future. Dave, it kind of reminded me of your little domain debacle, how the Alberta Party scooped up ChooseAlbertasFuture.ca right from under the PCs this time. That's kind of interesting, especially in 2015. You'd think buying a domain name would be a pretty straightforward thing you do when you're going to launch a campaign like that.
It usually should be top of the list.
All right. So what interesting races do you think there's going to be? Have you guys got to that level yet? Are there any two candidates stacked up that you think could be one to watch? There's been some interesting folks come forward in the last few days here before the writ dropped to be the candidates in certain places. So Catherine Keel in Edmonton Centre for the PCs, former deputy chief of staff for Mayor Mandel when he was mayor here in Edmonton. Some of those names like that. You've got a councillor running. I wrote the other day that we might end up with our first by-elections in 20 years here in Edmonton at least. I think they've had a couple in Calgary actually, but first one's in Edmonton with Tony Caterina running. Any other interesting races you're following?
Yeah, well, I think Glenora is going to be really fun to watch. Fun for those of us who aren't in the trenches and gutting it out. You have a high-profile cabinet minister, one of the relatively few female cabinet ministers running against Sarah Hoffman, who, of course, everyone knows, and she's a remarkable campaigner. So that'll be fun. I think Gold Bar will always be an interesting one to watch as well. It has a special place in my heart, and absolutely hope David Dorward is reelected, but it will be a tough fight. There's some other places where there's some compelling candidates where I don't expect it to be much of a race. In Rutherford, I think Chris Laboisiere would be great, but I think he'll win that fairly handily. So for me, probably the closest fight is going to be Glenora. If the orange wave hits again, it could be wide-ranging. There might not be very many PCs left, but that one, even without a wave, I think the PCs could be in trouble.
Two of the ridings I'm watching, I guess 2 or 3 of the ridings I could say, outside of Edmonton that I'm watching are two in Calgary. Pardon me. The first one is Calgary Buffalo, which is currently Liberal MLA Kent Hare's riding, and Kent is running for the federal Liberals in the next election in Calgary Centre, so he's not actually running in this provincial election. But the Liberals have nominated a lawyer named David Kahn. And the PCs have attracted a pretty high-profile candidate named Terry Rock, who's very big in the arts community. The thing about Calgary Buffalo, it's not really a traditional conservative Calgary riding. I think 9 or 10 or 7 or 8 of the last 10 elections, it's actually voted Liberal. So, if the Liberals are in a decline, it may go PC. It may go PC because the PC candidate's better. But I think it's definitely a race to watch because there were definitely, I would say, Kent Hare voters in that riding because Kent's a very popular MLA, very well liked in Calgary. But there is definitely a Liberal base in that riding. So Calgary Buffalo is one I'm watching. The other one in Calgary is Calgary Fort, which is actually really interesting because I think the NDP are actually, they're actually running a real campaign there. Former Alderman Joe Ceci is running against. I can't remember the name of the candidate who's just nominated by the Tories. I think his first name is Andy. He's a Calgary police officer, and I'll post it on Twitter when I do remember his name. It's embarrassing on my part. But that'll definitely be one to watch because the NDP haven't won a seat in Calgary in probably more than 20 years. So with a high-profile candidate like this, they're really pinning their hopes on it. Whether can Joe Ceci win, I don't know, but he's definitely going to run a strong campaign. And then the other one to watch, I think, is Lethbridge West, where Shannon Phillips is running for the NDP, and she's running against Greg Wiedek, who was a former cabinet minister. He's a PCMLA, so I think he's just a backbencher PCMLA right now. It was a very close race in the last election. Lethbridge is one of those cities where the Liberals used to do very well. The Liberals actually for years held the other Lethbridge seat of Lethbridge East. With the collapse of the Liberal Party, there seems to be Liberal votes going, at least in the last election, going towards the NDP, more progressive votes. And I know Shannon Phillips is running again. She's a very good, very articulate candidate. I think she'd be a fantastic MLA. So that'll definitely be one to watch as well. And then there's the question of all these rural ridings where that voted Wild Rose in the last election, and then the Wild Rose MLAs crossed the floor to the PCs. I mean, I think there are some MLAs in those ridings, Carrie Toll, for example, who I think are fairly popular. At least from my perspective, she seems to be very well liked. But the question is there going to be a lot of resentment from local voters and local organizers who helped elect Wild Rose MLAs last time, only to have those Wild Rose MLAs cross the floor? Will that actually lead to some of those new PC MLAs losing? And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that it really does depend. I mean, that's the easy answer. But so Carrie Toll is a good example. Some of them have been high profile, and I think the voters will stick with them. But I do think there's some ridings where the Wild Rose could pick seats up. You know, having a leader from Fort McMurray changes the equation a bit in the far northern ridings. It brings a bit more attention to places like Athabasca. But, you know, the trouble is for Wild Rose, you have a leader whose home riding is very difficult to get to. So I know from experience last time when I was working for one of the leaders whose riding was half an hour away from Calgary, that was a pain. Now, going to Fort Mac, that's a whole other thing. So there's some logistical challenges. It's also difficult to run a rural campaign because they're all spread out. You know, you could drive 10 hours and not leave the province. Whereas the Rachel Notley NDP, you know, they're going to run a campaign everywhere, but really they're focusing on Edmonton, which is much easier to do. It's one media market. No real people really even know which riding they live in. It all just blurs together. So I think Wild Rose is at a tactical disadvantage because the rural campaigns are so much harder to run. But I do think that they're going to pick up a few seats there just based on the mood. And, you know, some people in the far reaches of the province feel disconnected from the process and they feel a little bit upset. You know, it's a bit more of a populist kind of appeal, and I think they'll do okay. But, you know, back to the NDP in Calgary, I will eat my tie, my suit and my tie, or at least my tie if the NDP wins a seat in Calgary. Crazy things do happen, but I think we pundit types, which I guess I am now, we love to talk about stuff like that because it's more fun. But the reality is it is Calgary. And sure, they elect the odd Liberal MLA, but and they elected Nenshi too, I guess. But, you know, I just don't believe it. I guess we'll see.
So last time I did this vote results dashboard, right? And I'm going to do that again this year, but I just loaded it up quickly to see what happened in 2012. And the closest ridings last time were Calgary Fish Creek was just 74 votes, and that was Heather Forsyth that won for the Wild Rose. And the one that you already mentioned, Dave, Calgary Fort, was the next closest, followed by Edmonton Meadowlark, Dunvegan, Central Peace, Notley, Edmonton Beverly, Clairview. So not too many Calgary ones were very close last time. But if you look at the 10 closest races, actually most of them were PC that won, just sort of narrowly, right?
And Meadowlark will go back to PCs this time.
That was Ross Sherman last time, yeah. What do you guys think about turnout? I think last time the overall turnout was about 57% or something like that. Do you guys have a sense of whether or not more people are going to vote this time or less, or you know, anything that might swing it one way or the other in the next 4 weeks?
I think it really depends what the issues of the campaign are. I mean, last time it was a very competitive race. The we had all sorts of issues around, very divisive social conservative issues being discussed in the last few days of the election. A lot of fear coming from both sides, coming from all parties. I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to say what motivates people to get out and vote. I mean, I guess it's really going to depend on the parties and the party leaders connecting with voters and talking about issues that matter with people. But it's interesting when you talk about, who you ask the question, who does, or sorry, I'm going to ask the question, who does low voter turnout actually help? And that really depends on which party's voters are motivated to get out and vote. So, I think a lot of the conventional wisdom is that low voter turnout will help the government. But I don't know. I mean, it depends whose voters are staying home. So if everybody's just assuming that the Tories are going to win the election, it could mean that maybe NDP voters are more motivated to turn out if Conservatives think that their party is just going to win, or vice versa. I mean, if it looks like the NDP are going to sweep in Edmonton, or the Wild Rose are going to do very well in rural Alberta, that might be a better motivating factor for progressive Conservative voters or their candidates to get their votes out. So, it's hard. It's one of those things where as pundits, you kind of have to say it's wait and see, but it really is wait and see to depend on what the big issues of the campaign are.
Yeah, it is more nuanced than that, because last time, I've seen, and I'm sorry I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the Liberal vote collapsed, and those people all went over to the PCs. The Wild Rose actually did get most ideologically conservative votes, but everybody else went PC, and I'm not sure that happens this time. So I think, like you said, the broad strokes, low turnout is usually good for incumbents, but the nuance is it really just depends on the perception in that last weekend going into the final poll. Last time every headline in the country, not just Alberta, said Wild Rose majority, Wild Rose government, time for change. And I think that probably had an effect on the relative turnout for different parties. So I think that the problem with some of what's happened around floor crossings and all that stuff is that the cynicism it brings does drive turnout down. But fear is a motivator. So whether you're afraid of Rachel Notley forming government, or you're afraid of Brian Jean, or you're afraid of the PCs being rewarded for whatever they've done, we'll see.
The other factor I think that might impact voter turnout is just the number of candidates. I know I keep going back to that, but we're still fresh in the election. Last time it looks like there was 429 total candidates across all the parties. You had 4 parties that had 87 candidates, all ridings. This year so far we're sitting at 316. So it's quite a smaller number, and that could impact, I think, get out the vote efforts as well around the province too, right? So yeah, I guess it really comes down to what those issues might be. Just going back to polls, did you guys see the poll about, there was obviously the one that had the parties pretty close together, but there was another poll that said, the headline is, "Frustrated Albertans have nowhere to turn," poll suggests. From today, it's up on the Calgary Herald site, and it's from ThinkHQ, and says that people are fed up with the governing PCs, but they don't feel any other party has a viable opposition, which sort of seems to contradict the earlier polls, I think. Take on that, Dave.
Well, I think there are a lot of people who are generally frustrated with government, no matter if it's municipal, provincial, or federal. I think there's definitely a fatigue in the province of Alberta among a large percentage of our voting population. I mean, we traditionally have some of the lowest voter turnouts in the country, and I mean, people don't vote for a lot of reasons. I'm not going to say, there's the argument that people don't vote because they're trying to send a message to the government or they don't care. I think there's a whole mix of reasons why people don't vote, and I don't necessarily think that if all the people who don't vote showed up to vote, that the results would be very different. It obviously would make a difference in the number of ridings where there's close races, but overall, I don't think that if 100% of Albertans showed up, we'd probably still have a progressive Conservative government. Maybe they'd have less seats, maybe they'd have more seats. I'm sorry, I forgot your question.
Just asking about the poll. You know what? We're almost near the end. We should switch to something more fun anyway. So I'm just going to say one word, and then you guys can give me your reaction to that. Okay? You ready? Nickelback. Do you think people just made a whole lot of noise about nothing, or was the way that the writ dropped kind of interesting to you?
Well, Jim Prentice is now the one name I think of when I hear Nickelback. It's totally ingrained in my mind. Jim Prentice is Nickelback. That campaign launch did it for me. That's for better or worse. That's whether it was just someone sticking their iPod in and not doing proper advanced work, or if they thought it was a good idea. But no, Jim Prentice and Nickelback are inseparable now.
You know, this whole hating Nickelback thing is such an example of being out of touch with real people. Twitter hates Nickelback, there's no question. All the people I know in my life who vote anything other than conservative hate Nickelback. But yet, someone's buying all these albums. Like, Nickelback has sold more albums in the last 15 years than just about any act in the world. And so it's funny, it is funny, and I make fun of Nickelback as much as the next guy. But two things about this. One, campaign events are about stagecraft as much as anything else, and that is one small error they've made. But everything else they're doing on the PC campaign is just unbelievable. And, I happen to know the people doing it, and they're the best in the business. And the photos, the presentation, everything about it is great. But this idea that things like the song is what moves voters is exactly, and I know you're not really saying that, guys, but this is exactly an example of real voters worked 10 hours today, somewhere out in some rural site, and they're away from their husband and kids, and they have to sleep at a camp, but they're working hard and they're saving money, and they just want the government to worry about what it's supposed to worry about. Like, we run out of things to talk about, but they're not paying attention to the Brian Jean apology or to the Nickelback song. They want to know what's in it for them. They're going to pay attention on the last week when the Journal or the Herald runs some sort of table contrasting the platforms. So I think the role of these parties until then is just survival. Keep the bozo eruptions to a minimum. Don't annoy people, and don't give the headline writers anything to pick on, because really, it's like basketball. It's all going to come down to the last minute, and until then, they're just going to tour around and go to every iconic place in the province and hopefully not screw up.
That's probably a good way to put it. What's the saying? I can't remember who it's attributed to, but social media won't win you an election, but it can lose you one. I guess that kind of speaks to your survival sentiment, Ryan, definitely. On the other hand, that's kind of depressing. That means all this talk for the next 3 weeks is just...
Well, no, but the narratives can be set now, right? I mean, you can set things up that will dog them for the rest of the campaign. There can be things that voters do notice that annoy them, and that stuff can be set now. I think if you're the incumbent, you just want to keep your head down. If you're the challengers, you're trying to throw haymakers and land a punch. This is all obvious, but it's hard. It's easy to say, but it's hard to do. The thing that I'm kind of watching too is the role that the mayors will play. Both major mayors and even all the rest of them are very, very popular. They tend to be much more personally popular than any politician at the other levels. They also feel very free, just speaking generally, free to reach out, to take shots, to get involved in elections, where the other two levels don't. Mayor Nenshi is very comfortable basically throwing bombs into races at the other two levels. And so we'll see what happens there. He got involved last time by quasi-endorsing the Wild Rose platform and then kind of taking it back. I don't know if that's Mayor Iveson's style as much, but they have the potential to really swing votes, and I think it's also true in other centers like Red Deer and Lethbridge as well. So I'm going to be watching them.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing to watch. I mean, I think Nenshi already, waded into this one a little bit, didn't he, the other day? I think he had some pretty explosive things to say about the government. So.
And can you imagine his reaction if a federal MP got involved in his race in Calgary? He would lose his mind. If any MP, never mind a conservative MP, or MLA, but especially the MPs, if they were to come out and say that the mayor of Calgary should stick to his own business, he'd go apocalyptic. I can't say the word, but the reality is mayors are able to do things. I guess this leads us to Stephen Mandel, and the Stephen Mandel that was mayor was very vocal about the arena, about cuts to Alberta education. So, what would Mayor Mandel say now?
remarkably quiet, I would say, has been former Mayor Mandel. All right, we're just about out of time. I guess, Dave, we should give you the last word here since you've been a little quiet in the last few minutes. What should people pay attention to?
Obviously, one of the things that I'm going to be paying attention to, and I haven't heard much about it yet, but discussion around the leaders' debate. Every year, every election, we have this kind of weird discussion. The pundits have this weird discussion about, and politicos have this weird discussion about who should actually be allowed to join the leaders' debate. Should it be the parties that won seats in the last election? Should it be the parties that are running full slates of candidates? And I think it's a good question. I mean, for this election, we have. I mean, personally, I think this is kind of me. I might be an outlier here, but I think we should invite all party leaders to join the leaders' debate. If you're engaged enough to actually go out and lead a party, you should be allowed to join the debate. I mean, whether you're the leader of the Progressive Conservatives or the leader of the Communist Party. I actually think it would be quite entertaining to watch the leader of the Communist Party and Jim Prentice debate each other. I think that'd be fantastic. And I think it would be good for democracy too, and it would be absolutely entertaining. But it'll be interesting to see the debate around the leaders' debate. So the discussion around the leaders' debate, especially around parties like the Alberta Party, whether Greg Clark, Alberta Party leader, who doesn't have a seat in the legislature, but arguably came very close to winning a seat in a by-election last September, should he be allowed to join the leaders' debate, for example? And I think we'll hear a lot of that from the Alberta Party. And the same question for the Liberals, I think, at this point. Whereas, the Liberals, they're only running, I think, 31 or 33 candidates at this point. They may not run a full slate of candidates. There's only 2 incumbents, Liberal MLAs, running for re-election. One of them is actually endorsed and has the nomination of the Alberta Party. So,
yeah.
Does Laurie Blakeman having the Alberta Party nomination and the Liberal Party nomination, is that a good argument for Greg Clark being allowed into the leaders' debate? Because technically you could say that the Alberta Party has a nominated incumbent MLA running for re-election, which is, I mean, it's a totally strange debate because we've never had a situation like that in Alberta. But I mean, I think it's actually kind of a compelling argument. It's if you're going to make that rule for the rest of the leaders, why not apply it to Greg Clark? So anyway, I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion around that over the next week as the leaders' debates get planned. If there's a leaders' debate, I'm just assuming there's going to be.
Yeah, I'm assuming there would be as well, and I'm with you on just letting them all the leaders take part. It was one of the most fun things about the municipal election, right? Was the mayoral debates where we had everybody there. Like, it doesn't matter if you're Don Iveson or Karen Levivici or anyone else, right? And it was quite entertaining, and maybe that's what it takes to get people.
But is that actually good for democracy? Like, it's fun and it's
but if
funny.
It gets people into it, what's wrong with that?
Well, I think sometimes people look at that and they just see a clown show and they disengage and they say, well, why would I vote? This is crazy. Like, I don't mean disrespect to the Alberta Party, and they probably should be allowed. But when you start getting into the Communist Party and the Rhinoceros Party and whoever else is running, like, one of the things I like about the American system is there's 2 clear, strong alternatives that fear each other, and there's some competition there. I think if you're Jim Prentice, you would love to have 10 leaders, because then it's just a clown show. Sure, they'll gang up on him, but he'll just shrug his shoulders and look like the grown-up. And I'm not sure that inviting everybody is better. You look at the federal idea and having Elizabeth May there, I'm not sure if it was the right thing to do or not, but at least she had her own seat. The Alberta Party consistently is at like 5% in the polls, and I maintain those 5% or 95% of them are on Twitter. If you go out to like Safeway and ask people about the Alberta Party, I don't think most people will even know that it's a thing. And no disrespect to them, but I don't think we need any more than the main candidates for premier at the leaders' debate.
Well, then that would be the three parties with the full slate of candidates then.
That might be a good threshold.
If you've got a full slate, then you're in the debate, basically.
Yeah.
It even rhymes. Full slate, you're in the debate.
Full slate for the debate.
We have our slogan already.
You should just ask us.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, that takes us to the hour. So for everyone who tuned in online at abvote.ca, thanks for watching. You can check us out online. Ryan Hassman is at Ryan Hassman on Twitter and ryanhassman.com. Dave Cornway is Dave Cornway on Twitter and daveberta.ca, and you can find the full list of nominated candidates there as well, everybody who's running in the election. And I'm MasterMac online, mastermac.ca. So stay tuned to the AB Vote hashtag, and check out abvote.ca for our next Hangout.